Okay, let's dive into something pretty foundational today. We're looking at this really powerful text, quite challenging, actually. It zeroes in on a conviction the author holds very deeply, that the legal subordination of one sex to the other is just fundamentally wrong. And more than that, a massive roadblock to human progress.
Exactly. It's a piece that argues this whole long-standing social structure, well, it needs replacing completely, with what the author calls perfect equality.
Perfect equality, meaning like no inherent power or privilege for one side, no disability for the other.
Precisely. And our mission here really is to unpack the arguments the author uses to make that case. Because it's not just a suggestion, it's a very detailed argument against deeply established social relations.
Right, and they also knows it's a tough sell, don't they? They say up front this is an arduous task.
Oh, yeah. Very clear about that. But interestingly, they say it's not because the reasons for equality are weak.
Mm.
The difficulty comes from confronting something massive, this huge amount of ingrained feeling and custom.
It's like trying to argue against gravity, maybe, when everyone just feels things should be a certain way.
That's a great analogy. It really captures that sense of pushing against something that feels almost natural or inevitable to most people.
And that brings us straight to this point the author makes about the unique challenge of arguing against opinions that are almost universal. What's different here?
Well, the argument is when you challenge something almost everyone accepts, you don't just have to counter the existing reasons for it. You basically have to anticipate every single possible argument someone might dream up against you.
Wow.
Yeah, and provide, quote, invincible positive arguments to prove a negative. Essentially proving something isn't true, which, as you can imagine, is a huge burden of proof.
Right. And they contrast this with how we normally handle things, like in law or policy discussions.
Exactly. Usually, the default position, the presumption, is liberty, freedom. If you want to restrict someone or create some kind of inequality, the onus is on you to show why it's necessary, based on justice or public good.
But that gets flipped here.
That's what the author observes. When it comes to the subjection of women, those standard rules just seem suspended. The mere fact that it is the way things are, that it's universal custom, that popular feeling supports it, that seems to count as enough proof for the system. It kind of outweighs reason for many.
So the sheer weight of it's always been this way creates its own justification almost.
It gains this momentum, this presumption of being right, just by existing everywhere. It's less about logic, more about feeling and habit.
So that's the real fight then, not just logic, but overcoming that deep-seated feeling that inequality is somehow natural.
That seems to be the core challenge identified, overcoming the feeling that it's natural because it's customary.
Okay, so if it wasn't reason or some grand plan, where did the system originate according to the source? The answer is pretty blunt, isn't it?
It really is. The argument is stark. It didn't come from careful thought or ideas about social good or anything like that. It simply arose because women, generally having less muscular strength, were essentially captured and held in bondage from the very earliest human societies.
That's the law of the strongest.
Yep, brute force. And then, over time, that initial reality, that physical power dynamic, got formalized. It solidified into laws, customs, social expectations.
And the author finds that kind of weird, right? In a supposedly civilized age.
Yes, almost paradoxical.
Yeah.
We claim to have moved beyond the law of the strongest in other areas of society, politics, commerce, law. So why, the author asks, does it persist as the very foundation of this most fundamental human relationship?
It's a powerful question. If might doesn't make right elsewhere, why here?
And they make a really interesting point about how incredibly durable institutions founded on force can be. They're very slow to change or disappear, especially, they argue, when they get tangled up with everyday habits and, crucially, power structures that benefit the powerful.
And in this case, the power isn't just held by kings or nobles.
No, that's the key. It benefits every single male head of a family. The power is distributed right down into the household.
Making it much more personal and pervasive.
Exactly. And the desire for power, or maybe just control or convenience, is often strongest in those immediate relationships, where someone else's independence might directly clash with your own will or comfort. So even if it started with force, it's maintained by this widespread personal interest.
Yeah, okay, and this connects back to that word natural, the idea that women's subjection is just natural.
Right. And the author pushes back hard on this. They argue that natural very often just means customary, or maybe uncustomary. Because the subjection of women was so universal, anything else felt jarring, alien, fundamentally unnatural.
Like those examples they use. About queens or women in politics?
Precisely. They mention how people in some cultures were astonished to hear England had a queen regnant seemed completely unnatural because it wasn't their custom. But then they point out, in feudal times, for aristocratic women, being involved in politics or even warfare didn't seem so unnatural because it was part of the custom for that specific class.
So what feels natural is really just what we're used to seeing.
That's the core argument. Our feelings about what's natural are deeply shaped by custom and familiarity, not necessarily by some underlying truth.
Okay, let's get really specific now and look at the legal reality the system created, particularly for a wife. The source doesn't mince words here.
No, definitely not.
Yeah.
They make the frankly shocking claim that the wife is the actual bondservant of her husband, no less so than slaves commonly so called.
Directly comparing her legal status to a slave, what are the specific legal points they use to back that up? It's a strong claim.
It is. They list several things. First, the marriage vow itself included lifelong obedience. Second, legally, she couldn't really do anything, enter contracts, sue, be sued without her husband's permission, explicit or implied. Third, and this is huge, she couldn't acquire or own property in her own right. Anything she earned or inherited automatically became his.
And they even bring in Roman law for comparison.
Yes, to really hammer the point home. They note that under Roman law, even a slave could have a peculium, a small amount of personal property the law sort of recognized. But English common law, at the time this was written, denied the wife even that minimal level of separate economic identity.
What about things like marriage settlements for wealthy women? Did that help?
The author acknowledges those existed. Settlements could protect a wife's inherited property from being squandered by the husband, but they emphasize this didn't give the wife control. The property was usually held by trustees, and even if income was designated for her separate use, the husband could often still legally take it unless she could prove extreme circumstances like his adultery combined with cruelty. And for most women, of course, there were no settlements at all.
So the default was total absorption of her property.
Total absorption. And that legal idea of husband and wife being one person in law, the author points out, it was pretty conveniently applied. It meant he got her property and was responsible for her debts or actions, like a master for a dependent. It didn't work the other way around, giving her reciprocal rights over his property or person.
Beyond money and property, what about her actual personal freedom, day-to-day life?
This is where the text argues her situation, legally, could be seen as even more confining than some other forms of servitude. She is a slave, they say, at all hours and all minutes. There's no off-duty. Unlike, say, a field slave who might have specific tasks and then sometime that was theoretically their own, the wife was legally subject to her husband's will constantly within the home.
And there's a point the author calls the absolute lowest degradation.
Yes. The husband's legal right to demand sex, regardless of her feelings, consent, or how he treated her. The text is explicit about this, calling it a violation of her person that the law sanctioned. This, they argue, was an extreme form of control inherent in the legal structure.
What about children? Did the mother have legal rights regarding her own kids?
Legally. According to the source, no. The children were considered his. The mother had no automatic legal rights to custody or control unless he chose to delegate them or granted them in his will after his death. He could, legally, make decisions about their upbringing, even send them away without her consent.
Was there any recourse? Any change happening?
They do mention one small change, Sergeant Talford's Act, which allowed courts in some cases of separation to grant the mother custody of very young children, under 7. But it was limited, and the fundamental legal power still resided with the father.
And if the marriage was terrible, could she just leave?
Legally, escape was almost impossible. If she left, she could take nothing with her, not the children, not any property, since it was legally his. He had the legal right to compel her return, using force if necessary, or through the courts. He could also seize anything she earned or was given after she left. Legal separation was difficult and expensive to obtain.
And the grounds for divorce or separation were incredibly narrow.
Astonishingly so. The source claims, no amount of ill usage, without adultery superadded, will in England free a wife from her tormentor. Physical abuse alone wasn't enough.
It's a devastating legal picture.
Yeah.
But the author is careful to say this isn't how every marriage actually works. Right?
Yes, that's crucial. They acknowledge many men didn't exercise these powers or did so benevolently. But the point is about the law. The law granted this absolute power. And laws, they argue, have to be designed considering bad actors, not just good ones. This legal framework gave potentially tyrannical power over another human being to any man, down to the, quote, vilest malefactor, simply by virtue of being a husband.
Okay, so this extreme legal inequality, this concentration of power in one person's hands within the home, what are the consequences? How does it affect people, relationships, the family itself?
Well, the author argues pretty strongly that giving anyone that kind of absolute power is corrupting. It fosters vices. It can lead to domestic tyranny, where a man who might be decent and controlled in public among equals feels free to unleash anger, violence, or just petty despotism on those legally dependent on him, his wife, and children.
But what about the counter-argument you sometimes hear? That wives weren't truly powerless. They had influence, maybe their own ways of controlling things, sort of counter-tyranny.
The author addresses that directly. Yes, they concede women do exert influence. Sometimes they suggest it's even a mischievous influence because their own character has been shaped, or perhaps warped, by their subordinate position. But, and this is the main point, influence gained through manipulation, pleading, or working around the power structure is absolutely not a substitute for freedom and independence.
It's not real agency.
Exactly. It's not compensation for lacking control over your own life and decisions, and the author sees this whole structure built on such unequal power as a monstrous contradiction to modern ideas of justice.
And it actually harms moral development.
That's a key argument. The family, instead of being a school for freedom and justice, becomes a school of despotism. It cultivates the habits and attitudes suited to a master-slave relationship, dominance on one side, perhaps subservience or cunning on the other, rather than the virtues needed for people to live together as equals.
Does this inequality also impact the possibility of real companionship in marriage?
Very much so, according to the author. The system actively enforces a huge difference in education, experiences, and therefore character between men and women. This radical dissimilarity makes genuine, deep companionship and unity really difficult to achieve. The author strongly believes that likeness, shared understanding, similar cultivation is what truly sustains happiness in a partnership, not the enforced unlikeness.
Because that difference breeds conflict.
Yes, conflicts of will, opinion, inclination are inevitable. And in an unequal power dynamic, how are they resolved? Often, simply by the husband exercising his legal authority, his arbitrary power. That prevents real unity, even on really important matters affecting them both.
Okay, so if that's the diagnosis of the problem, its origins in force, its legal manifestation, its negative consequences, what's the proposed solution? What's the path forward?
The core proposal is pretty radical for its time. Transform marriage into a contract between equals. Think of it more like a business partnership, where roles and responsibilities are decided by the partners based on their abilities and agreement, not dictated by law based on sex.
So legal equality is the foundation. And what impact would that have, not just legally, but on people's character?
The author anticipates a profound positive impact. For women, it would help curb what they call the exaggerated self-abnegation. They were taught encouraging more independence, self-reliance, assertiveness. And for men, crucially, it would foster unselfishness. They'd lose the ingrained habit of assuming their will should automatically prevail simply because the law backed them up. They'd have to actually consider another equal person.
So it's not just about rights, it's about making people, well, better people, more just, more considerate.
That's exactly the idea. Equality is presented as the only way marriage can align with justice and happiness, and importantly, with moral development. It would turn the family from that school of despotism into a genuine school of moral sentiment, of learning to live freely and justly with equals.
Now, shifting focus slightly, the author doesn't just talk about marriage. They also argue strongly for opening up all societal roles and occupations to women, right?
Absolutely. And they connect this directly back to the domestic sphere. They argue that a primary reason women are excluded from wider society, from professions and public life, is precisely to maintain that subordination within the home.
How so?
The author puts it quite bluntly. The generality of the male sex cannot yet tolerate the idea of living with an equal. So, keeping women out of positions of influence or equality in the public world helps reinforce the power imbalance in the private world. It prevents men from having to confront female equality directly in their daily lives.
That's a provocative connection. So the barriers in public life prop up the system at home.
That's the strong contention. And to counter the idea that women just aren't capable of these roles, the author points to evidence. Look, they say, at what women have achieved in the very limited fields open to them. Literature, acting. Or look at historical examples, like queens who successfully managed complex affairs of state.
And this is despite significant disadvantages.
Exactly. Despite often being actively discouraged, lacking formal education equivalent to men, and having to fit these pursuits around demanding domestic duties, the author says something like, everything a woman does is done at odd times. The argument is, if they can achieve this much despite the barriers, imagine what they could do with equal opportunity. Any evidence of capability under disadvantage disproves inherent incapability.
Right. And the author even finds potential value in the mental characteristics women had developed under the existing system.
Yes, this is interesting. They talk about qualities like intuitive perception, maybe a quicker grasp of immediate facts, practical realities, individual circumstances. This focus, perhaps honed by managing households and dealing with concrete situations, could be incredibly valuable, they argue. It could ground abstract or theoretical thinking in human reality, help translate ideas into practice.
So it's not just about adding more people, but adding potentially different, valuable perspectives.
Precisely. Bringing a focus on the concrete, the individual, the practical, which can be a vital balance to purely abstract or speculative thought that might lose touch with lived experience.
What about the common objections back then? Things like supposed differences in brain size or women being too emotional, having a nervous temperament?
The author tackles those head-on. The brain size argument they dismiss as weak, pointing out, elephants have bigger brains than humans, tall men aren't automatically smarter than short men. They suggest size isn't everything. Quality, activity might matter more. They even speculate women's brains might be more active.
Okay. And the nervous temperament argument. Too emotional for serious work.
They argue that much of this perceived difference is likely due to lack of training and constrained lives' nervous energy with no proper outlet. And critically, they point out that when men display similar traits, high sensitivity, excitability, it's often seen positively. It's called spirit, enthusiasm, passion qualities needed for leadership or great achievement if properly trained and channeled.
So again, it's about opportunity and training, not inherent limits. Any real differences might affect the style of excellence, but not the capacity for excellence.
That's the core message. We can't even know what the natural differences truly are, they argue, because society has enforced such different paths for centuries. You need genuine equality of opportunity before you can even begin to assess natural capacity fairly.
Okay, let's zoom out. Taking all this together, what does the author see as the big picture benefits? For society, for individuals, if this perfect equality were actually achieved?
There are several major benefits laid out. First, just a massive boost to humanity's collective resources. You double the pool of talent available for virtually every useful endeavor. Society is essentially operating with one hand tied behind its back by excluding half the population.
That makes sense. More brain power, more energy.
Right. Second, it would inevitably lead to raising women's education to the same standard as men's, which benefits everyone. Third, the author believes women's influence on general opinion, which they felt was often sentimental or ill-informed under the current system, would become much more positive and grounded in reason if women were equally educated and engaged with the world.
And deeper societal changes, morality, relationships.
Yes, a profound improvement in moral culture, moving society away from norms based on force and command towards justice and reciprocity. And as we discussed, the potential for much better, happier, more fulfilling marriages based on genuine partnership and shared lives, rather than hierarchy.
And finally, there's a really powerful point about individual happiness, isn't there? About having an outlet for your abilities.
This is huge. The author argues passionately that having a worthy outlet for the faculties, being able to use your talents and pursue meaningful goals, is essential for human happiness. Denying this opportunity, as society did systematically for women, leads inevitably to weariness, disappointment, and profound dissatisfaction, regardless of material comfort. It's a fundamental human need.
So these arbitrary restrictions based on sex are actively creating unhappiness.
Exactly. They're drying up what the author calls the principal fountain of human happiness. Society shouldn't be adding more barriers to fulfillment than life already presents. It should be removing the artificial ones, especially those based on prejudice.
Wow. It really is a comprehensive argument. It forces you to look at the very foundations of social organization and ask if they align with ideals like justice, freedom, and well, human flourishing.
It absolutely does. And it makes a very strong case that the liberation and development of women isn't just, a women's issue. It's integral to the progress, the morality, and the overall well-being of all of humanity.
Okay, well, this has certainly been a deep dive. The source material really pushes us to examine assumptions we might not even realize we have about gender power and what's natural.
It challenges you to trace those assumptions back to their roots.
So let's leave you, our listeners, with a final thought to consider drawn right from the text we've been exploring. The author writes, "The true virtue of human beings is fitness to live together as equals, claiming nothing for themselves but what they as freely concede to everyone else, regarding command of any kind as an exceptional necessity, and preferring, whenever possible, the society of those with whom leading and following can be alternate and reciprocal." Something to reflect on. How far have we actually come in embodying that ideal today? Living together as equals, where leadership is shared, not assumed. Where do we still see resistance? Maybe subtle, maybe not so subtle, both out in the world and perhaps even in our own lives.